Jumbo, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Cross-Pollinating Justice. Today, I am here talking with Rebekah Gienapp. She is a writer, speaker, and parenting coach. I have been following her for a while, and I'm really excited to talk to her today. She's the author of Raising Anti-Racist Kids, an age-by-age guide for parents of white children. Her work focuses on nurturing a commitment to social justice and anti-racism in children, especially those whose families hold privilege. Her work has been featured by the Washington Post, National Geographic, Parenting Forward, and MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism. She is ordained in the United Methodist Church and lives with her family in Memphis, Tennessee. Rebekah, I'm so glad to have you here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I've really been looking forward to this conversation and love your work.
Well, thank you. So please tell me and our listeners a little bit more about what you do and how you came to do this work in the first place.
I would say the biggest issue my writing focuses on is anti-racism and the workshops that I offer, although I do other social justice issues as well. And I think it's really important to help children understand how privilege and power and lack of power overlaps. It's race is central to that, but isn't the only aspect of that. And came to this work, I guess, partly through my experience in the world and partly through my child. So I'll say what I mean by that. Um, so I have two kids. My stepson is well into young adulthood. And then I have a 12-year-old son. And when my now 12-year-old was in preschool, so I had been a community organizer before I came to this work, and racial and economic justice was kind of what I did every day. And then when my son was about almost a year old, I decided it was just too much to do that work full time and wanting to be the kind of parent, that I wanted to be with him. And so I stepped back from that work and became a stay-at-home parent. And around the age of, I guess, 3 or 4, when he started going to preschool, I noticed him saying things about race that really surprised me. And now I look back and think, well, it's not that surprising. He was reflecting kind of the biases of his culture that were around him. But saying things that really set off some alarm bells in my head and me kind of freezing up, not knowing how to respond to that. And sometimes responding way too harshly to things he would say, and other times just kind of freezing. And that was also around the time that Donald Trump was elected president the first time. And I saw all these other, I had already started blogging about diverse children's books. And so my readers, friends that I had in real life, I saw so many white liberal families really kind of freaking out, not knowing what to do about this in general, how to talk to their kids about it. And so I decided I needed to really um, do a deeper dive into anti-racism, particularly trying to understand it from the perspective of children. And so I started reading a lot, experimenting with my son. There weren't nearly as many people then as there are now writing about race and kids, particularly how to talk to white children about it. Because I think before there was sort of this perception of that's something children of color need to understand, but we don't need to talk to white children about it, which is not at all correct, as you know. And so I just started experimenting and then eventually got my courage up to start writing about it publicly, which was a little scary. And things just kind of went, from there. I ended up writing my book because I thought there was starting to be good advice out there, but it wasn't necessarily particular to which age or developmental stage kids are in, which is really important to me. Um, and so yeah, I put my book together and things just kind of went from there. So
Well, great. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research into how to approach race with different age groups?
Yeah, I am really influenced by the Montessori method of education. My mom's a retired Montessori teacher. Now that my son went to Montessori school, we've homeschooled mostly using Montessori in the last few years. And there's an understanding there that children from the ages of like birth to 6 versus 6 to 12, so sort of the early years versus what we
Mhm.
think of as the elementary years, really go through a very radical shift. So it's not just like a gradual getting older and changing in their understanding. So, children that are in those early years, they really need very concrete um, experiences, and that is how they learn. They immerse themselves in things. They learn by imitating what's around them,
Mhm.
and so this isn't an age to like try to do abstract reasoning with them, which is a lot of times what we try to do because that's how we would talk to an adult, or
Mhm.
even a
Mhm.
teenager. But
Right.
that doesn't make sense to them. So instead, thinking about what kind of examples am I setting? What am I surrounding my child with? Who am I surrounding my child with? So everything from where you spend your time, how diverse are those spaces or not? What kind of stories do you read? What kind of media do you consume? What kind of conversations do you have with your child, but also they observe you talking or not talking about with adults? Because young kids really can pick up what are sensitive issues by what we avoid saying.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely right.
Right? Which is some of the stuff that happened with my child where I was like, oh, okay, wow, I was not
Well
expecting
then.
that. And then once they're in more of what we think of as that elementary age, that's when they're really start to become more interested in abstract concepts, in making connections between their reasoning. So that is a time where, I mean, you want to continue surrounding them with all these experiences and people and stories, but also you can start to talk about things like, what is racism at a more systemic level? I still really recommend, and I have a blog post about really specific examples that touch children's lives when we talk about that. So you're not going to try to with a 7-year-old necessarily talk about something like redlining and housing discrimination,
Right.
but you can start with things like school dress codes that have policies around hair that, when you look into them, are discriminatory against traditional Black hairstyles, or looking at going into a library or a bookstore and seeing who are the authors on the shelves and kind of how does that. Um, do you notice that it's almost all white authors, things like that. So you can do more of that in the elementary years because they do like making those connections. And they're also really influenced by their peers much more in the elementary years. So looking for opportunities to help them be in conversation with other kids their age. And what I've noticed is the like around 10, 11, 12 is where some children will really get interested in taking action in the community. But again, they really want to do that with their friends. Um, so I like sharing examples of groups. Like there's this wonderful music group called the Alphabet Rockers. And they don't just make music for kids about justice issues, they make music with kids. And they also do like these, I think they're sort of like mini camps. And some of the kids that they have worked with have gone on and started projects about immigration. And a lot of times they're arts based. So looking for ways that they can talk with other kids and take action if that's something they're interested in.
Okay. That's really cool. I'd never heard of alphabet rockers before, so I'm definitely gonna have to look them up because yeah, you're right. Anything you can do to make it tangible for kids, to make it fun is really helpful. How how were you initially received by other white parents that you were trying to reach out to?
So it was interesting when I started sort of shifting my public writing to, I still do tons of children's book list, but more from a general diversity message to specifically justice and anti-racism. And so this was like, I think when I finally got my courage up to be public, it was maybe like 2017. And I think most people who were already on my list, my email list, were supportive and curious. But I definitely got a significant minority of people who would write in and say, this is teaching kids to be racist because they don't notice race. They don't pay attention to that, and you're putting this in their heads. And so, I think that's gradually those folks have kind of drifted away, so I don't hear as quite as much of that. Although when I was doing more videos on Instagram from strangers slash people who I think probably are deliberately looking for posts to comment on would
Yes.
say things like that. But I think for the most part, the people that I was in touch with were even if they didn't agree with every single thing I said, they knew it was important and they felt this need to um, kind of live into that intersection of there's lots of stuff out there about what white people can do about racism, but I'm really focused on my family right now and feeling lost because what I would notice is there were sort of two tendencies people would move toward. There would be folks like me who had been pretty deeply rooted in activism or organizing. And folks like us can easily overwhelm our children, right? And just dunk all
Yes.
this information on them. Or I remember panicking about things that I thought I needed to help my kid understand right away, not realizing that I had actually a lot of years to do this gradually in a way that would not push him away. Because I think I did some things at first that were a little too frightening for him.
Mhm.
But then for a lot of other white parents who, have when I say politics, I don't social views, I guess. I don't necessarily mean we're recording this right before the election day. I don't necessarily mean like how people vote in the voting booth, but like how they understand what they want the world to be. Um, or more progressive, but we're really unsure about when to start talking to kids about that and feeling like, well, probably I just need to wait till they're a little older because they can't understand that now, not realizing that younger kids especially are these sponges that are soaking things up. So we need to figure out how to talk to them in ways that are age appropriate and don't overwhelm, but we can't just wait until high school and then sit down and open up a conversation. I would say it's sort of like when I was growing up, there was this idea that you could give kids like the sex talk, which I think
Yes.
now
Mhm.
people realize no, that is usually awkward and not all that great. It's a multitude of smaller conversations about things that have to do with dating and relationships and sex that you can, have over many years. That's the most effective way to have an impact on your kids.
Yes, that's exactly right. I completely agree that number one, you have to start early. When people ask me when should I start, I'm always like yesterday. And if you couldn't start yesterday, start right now. There's always something you can say, there's always something you can do, but also that it's not and I think this is very important because in the literature and in the media, there's a lot of focus on particularly Black parents having the talk with our kids, but it's never like we just sit down and have a talk. These are talks that we've been having with our kids their entire lives. And so, speaking of parents and families of color, how do you, in your work, sort of bring together both parents of color and white parents who are in this fight together to sort of work together and figure out a way forward together?
Yeah, so one of the things I try to do when I am talking about how to talk about race with kids, I do tell people, as a white person, um, I don't really feel comfortable telling people of color how they should talk to their children of color. But what I do try to do is share my advice for white parents and then link to other resources, talk about Black mothers in particular. Not that I haven't learned from other people of color, but that's been kind of salient in my learning, who I have learned from, shine a light on their resources and encourage people to check them out. Um, and especially, I think, pre 2020, before we had sort of this explosion of interest, highlighting conversations that parents of color were having with their kids to try to, not only for parents of color who needed those examples, but for white parents to understand why we have a responsibility to talk to our kids. That this idea that we can put it off till later puts an additional burden on families of color, because we're not having those conversations, and you never know when a white child is going to either intentionally or unintentionally, expose a child of color to a stereotype or a racial slur, or any of those kind of things. And then I think probably the most important is I do so many children book reviews, and I really try to focus whenever possible on what we call own voices books that are written about characters by authors who share their background, whether that's their race, their ethnicity, neurodivergence, those kind of things. Because, I mean, as you know, with your work with John Boat Books, those authors tend to get promoted a lot
Mhm.
less, and they have such wonderful work. But unless you walk into your library and see a display, or come across it on social media, or on a website like one of ours, you're not as likely to hear about them. Um, and I've also heard from white parents who have children of color through interracial marriages or transracial adoption, how important they know those resources are for their kids in particular, including, just like I know you emphasize, I don't know what you call it. I call it everyday stories. So stories that are starring kids of color, that are not necessarily about racism or injustice. So they're about joyful things, or like hard problems, like your friend suddenly doesn't want to talk to you, all those kind of things that kids are thinking about all the time, or magical stories, um, to provide those joyful or reflective experiences for kids of color, and to say to white kids, um, being Black or being Asian or Latino isn't just about this narrow experience of being on the receiving end of racism or those kind of things. They are complex people just like you are, and they're having these complex experiences like you are.
Yes, exactly right. Every kid is the main character of their own lives, right? They have major main character energy, as they're saying, but that's exactly what we say is that, the stories of children of color don't just resonate in trauma. There's a lot of joy, there's a lot of love and mystery and disappointment and all the different things that everyone else feels. So thank you so much for doing that and for highlighting those authors, because also, as you noted, their books are in print for a lot less time than authors who are white. It seems like every time I pick a book in 3 months, it's gone out of print and I can't get it to my customers. So, yes, thank you for supporting Own Voices authors. So, another question I have for you is, as you mentioned, we are in election season right now, and there's a lot of nervousness going on, I think amongst all communities. So, how are you sort of protecting your sanity and your family in this time of really great un sort of unrest, unease? Yes.
Yeah, so I think one thing that our family's doing a little differently than we did, I would say since the pandemic, we got into a really bad habit of dinner time. So there's three adults in our house. We got my stepson, my husband, and I, and then my not so little guy anymore. And dinner time was sort of like when we all reviewed the bad news of the day that we had heard about, whether it was COVID related, political related. Um, and I don't think we realized until much later what a toll that was taking on all of us. And my husband is kind of naturally a pessimistic guy and a news junkie. So now I've sort of said in the last few weeks, like, not that we're not going to talk about it at all, but that I'm the one who's usually like, okay, now we're going to talk about something else.
Yes.
Because it's important to be aware, but I think when we start stewing, that actually makes us less powerful, at least as for me, and less likely to act. So, sort of knowing what my point is between being informed and getting into like a downward spiral. So that's one thing. I think the other thing the pandemic did was made me a lot more aware of what habits or what hobbies really nourish me. And I've found that being outdoors and gardening is really important to me. Doing things with my hands, I like to knit. So making sure that when I'm starting to feel, because I do struggle with both depression and anxiety, when I can feel things sort of shifting, asking myself, okay, when's the last time you've done one of those things? Or spending time one-on-one with friends because I'm an introvert, so I don't really like going to big group things, but like that one-on-one time is important. Um, and the last thing I would say is over the years, I've gotten better at kind of honing in my focus, both on the issues that I'm going to take action on, um, because it's really easy to burn out when you're trying to do a little of this, a little of that, and also getting clear on the people who I can influence and the people who I cannot.
That's right.
Because I
That's
think that's
right.
the other thing the internet culture can really do to us is get us distracted by the people that we have little to no ability to influence, instead of thinking about the folks who actually are in our circle, who take what we have to say much more seriously, and who we can have a more um, curious and compassionate and brave approach to conversation and action with than you can with like random commenter on Instagram. And I speak from experience.
Oh, absolutely right. Like trying to persuade a bot is no bueno, right? Like, what are we even trying to do here? Even when I had some friends who live I live in Georgia, which is a swing state, consider a swing state, and I have a friend who lives in another swing state, and she was telling me about she works for these people who are going to vote for Trump, and she wants to figure out how she can change their minds. I was like, oh, honey, no, 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 no. That's not where we're going to spend our time. You need to find your low to mid propensity Democratic voters because we don't need to spend a whole lot of time spinning our wheels with folks who, like you said, aren't really in our audience. And, maybe one day they come along and maybe they don't, but you try to be the most effective where you can be effective.
Right, right. And I think, if it's someone like your grandma or or someone, then that's
Yes.
still worth having a conversation. Maybe she's not gonna change her vote in this election, but like a coworker that you're not particularly close to. Because what I find for me is then I get so frustrated that I start to get in this kind of like metaphysical space of like, what's wrong with humanity?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and it like dims my understanding that actually most people out there are trying to do the right thing, and they are interested in hearing from you. Most people are not this super frustrating coworker who is spouting off disinformation and that kind of thing.
That's right. So a question I have for you is based on something you were talking about before. And, I go through all the things that you mentioned, like with the depression, the anxiety, all of that. And a lot of it for me is rumination as well. And I find that rumination does lead to freeze. To like I can't do anything now. So since you've broken out of it before and you help people break out of it, do you have any suggestions or tips for people when they find themselves sort of spiraling in that rut where there's nothing I can do to help? Like, how do you help them get to the other side?
Yeah. So one thing that I find for me is helpful in because sometimes the mood is so heavy you just can't even do anything. And so for me, music, not just listening to it, but actually singing, whether it's just in my car or at church or, sometimes in my office, wherever, um, is really important. And I actually have playlists designed on how I want to feel. So I have my like get up and get it done kind of playlist. I have my like faith a hopeful faith playlist that's something I listened to this morning and I'll probably have on repeat on this eve of election day. Um, and so, because I find that can shift my mood more than just trying to talk myself into shifting my mood. So, for some people, that might be music. For other people, maybe it's some other form of art or spending time with particular people, like figuring out whatever that is that does some of that mood lifting for you so that you can actually be ready for whatever the next step is. Um, and another thing I try to do is focus on people who are in a situation that seems really hopeless. So, one of the things I've been very focused on for the past year is what's happening in Palestine. And that is a situation where it would be really easy to say, just nothing seems to be working. People have been calling for a ceasefire for so long, there's so many people suffering. But instead, what I try to focus on is I've come to know a lot of these little different grassroots groups. Some of them are like children's book authors. Some of them are artists who are like raising money for families in Gaza, who are
Mhm.
showing videos of the families themselves speaking. And so I try to focus on what those people are doing and remind me that that's where the hope is, even if it doesn't seem like much is changing yet. Um, and remind myself also that if those folks are out there being so brave, a lot of them much taking huge risks that I'm not having to take, then yeah, I need to show up in my ways too, and I find that that really helps me.
That's spoken like a true community organizer. You're like, I find the grassroots people and I get in there and I help them. That's really helpful. I really like to hear that because you're absolutely right. I was just talking with some parents at my daughter's preschool where they're saying the problems just feel so big and overwhelming, and what can I possibly do? Um, so I want you to tell us a little bit about the resources that you have for folks. Because, and I'm going to put them in the show notes as well, but I want people to be able to hear from you what you offer, how they can reach you, and how they can to get plugged in with you to learn more and do more.
Yeah. So I'd say the best place to be in touch with me right now is my website, but particularly my email list. I'm not on social much right now, and I tend to kind of get excited and post a bunch and then go quiet. So
It's so
definitely
hard.
get on my email list because I'm really consistent there. And I have a library of free resources. So I have my book, Raising Anti-Racist Kids, but I also have some shorter guides that are in the resource library that'll take you through. One of them is called "What's Wrong with Saying Equal," saying we're all equal. 5 conversations about race that white parents need to have, because that's one of those like abstract concepts that we tend to talk to young kids, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" So there's guides like that. There's another one on responding to when a child says something biased that are really practical. And if you're the kind of person who, I know I learn better from specific examples a lot of times than from big principles, those will be in there for you. There's also guides to some of my favorite diverse books for different ages, some kid activist stuff. There's a guide on spotting stereotypes of Native Americans in children's books, because those are oftentimes I'll find I'm reading a book, not as much, luckily, in the last few years, but it has nothing to do, I thought, with Native Americans, and it'll just be like something that's just sort of slipped in there. So all that's available in the free resource library and the website. Definitely check the show notes for how to spell my name, but it's RebekahGienapp.com. And I love hearing from people too. If you write me, I will write you back as long as you're fairly nice. Sometimes I ignore emails that are, you know, not curious and
They don't
conversational.
deserve your time, Rebekah. Don't give it. Don't give it. No pearls
But
before swine.
I don't think anyone would be listening to this podcast if that was kind of their motivation.
Very true. Okay, so you've given us a lot of tips, and you are completely welcome to say, I've given you all the tips I have. Go back and listen and figure out a step you can take. But I do like to give people at least one thing that they can do this week to move the ball forward toward equity, toward justice. So you're talking to parents and teachers and caregivers of a whole slew of ages. But if you could give one tip, one step they could take, what would that be?
So, I mentioned earlier I love the Montessori method, and part of it is observation. So, I would say take maybe a few days, maybe like a 3-day period this week, and be a little bit of a nerd and take some notes, but just observe how is race showing up or not showing up in the conversations you're having with kids. And also, like, if you're an educator, that would be like, or a parent of multiple kids, the conversations they're having with each other. So in whether it's a classroom or home, how is race showing up or not showing up? So that could be everything from for I know for some white parents, a conversation where it would be natural to actually use racial labels, but you're really trying hard not to. Like, well, why is that? And you don't have to talk about it with your kid then, but like spend some time thinking about that. Or maybe you notice some things like I mentioned with my son, where you see little biases popping up, but because it's in a sort of indirect way, you haven't stopped to address it. Take notes on all that stuff because until you've observed what's actually happening with the kids in front of you, I think it's hard to know what your next step needs to be, and just gaining that awareness. Because a lot of times when I've given in-person workshops, white parents in particular will say to me like, "Well, I don't really think my kids are thinking about race." But then when we talk more, they'll remember, "Oh, a couple years ago we were watching Black Panther, and my child said, 'Why aren't there any white people in this movie?'" And they didn't really know how to notice or how to answer it, and so they just kind of moved on. So yeah, spend maybe a 3-day period observing, jot down your notes, and then that'll help you do better searches. I mean, you're always welcome to write to me and ask, like, say, this is my situation. What do you think would help me work on this? But also to look for, there's lots of great articles out there if you know more specifically what you need some help on. So that'd be my tip is observe for about 3 days so that you can take action and better conversations with your kids.
That's a wonderful tip. And I really want to point out that you have been talking sort of throughout our chat about mindfulness, right? So
Mm,
much of what you've been talking about is notice what you're doing, notice what you're thinking, notice what your kids are doing, notice how you feel, notice what makes you feel good. Like, you know, mindfulness I used to think was just about being, very woo-woo and peaceful. But I've learned that it really is about actually being mindful about what is happening right now. And it doesn't have to do with, some, what's the word, perfect state, blissful state, but that it has to do with noticing who you are and where you are and trying to get better from there. So thank you so very much for bringing that out.
yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of times especially when I was younger, I was sort of in this mindset of like, there's so much wrong in the world. I don't have time to think about myself or my personal, how I'm showing up. I just got to go do stuff. And that can be a place where, first of all, it's prone to burnout, but also you as an individual can do a lot of harmful things when you are lacking any of that awareness, checking in with yourself. So it's one of the things that I think I've learned from a lot of other people and sort of seen what happens when I don't have those pauses.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Rebekah.
Thank you, Mija. I really enjoyed this conversation.